The story opens with Paul McGuire, a seemingly successful businessman, picking up his daughter, Caitlin, from high school. This immediately establishes him as a present and caring father. However, beneath the surface of his respectable life lies a hidden past. It's revealed that Paul was once a highly respected mafia boss in America, a life he has since abandoned to build a legitimate existence for his family. On the drive home, Caitlin, like any teenager, asks her father for permission to invite two male friends over. She mentions one of them, Mike, has a romantic interest in her. Paul, demonstrating his protective nature, agrees, but with the clear condition that they behave politely. This sets the stage for the introduction of Mike and his friend, who will later play a pivotal role in the tragic events that unfold. After dropping off Caitlin, Paul heads to a cafe to meet his two closest friends, Kane and Francis. Their meeting reveals that Kane and Francis were Paul's right-hand men during his mafia days. They too have followed Paul's lead and chosen to live a life outside of crime. At the cafe, Paul discusses plans for Caitlin's birthday party, revealing his dedication to his daughter's happiness. Kane, who owns the cafe, generously offers the venue without charge, highlighting the strong bond of friendship between the three men. Later, Paul attends the opening of his business, giving a speech and thanking the investors who have supported him. This further emphasizes his successful transition to a legitimate lifestyle. That evening, Paul and his wife are preparing to go to dinner with investors. Before leaving, Paul interacts with Caitlin and her friends, including Mike. During a private conversation with Mike, Paul's protective instincts kick in. He questions Mike about any involvement with drugs or gangs, making it clear that he will not tolerate anything that could endanger Caitlin. Mike vehemently denies any involvement, and Paul, satisfied with his response, asks Mike to look after Caitlin. While Paul and his wife are at dinner, tragedy strikes. A police detective arrives and informs them that Caitlin has been kidnapped during a home invasion. Paul and his wife rush home to find the police investigating the scene. Mike and his friend are present, visibly shaken and injured. The detective explains that the incident doesn't appear to be a simple robbery, as nothing was stolen, suggesting a deliberate kidnapping. Paul is understandably distraught and confused, trying to understand who would target his daughter. The detective suggests that Paul's past as a mafia boss is the most likely motive. He urges Paul to remain calm and promises that the police will do everything they can to find Caitlin. After the detective leaves, Paul's wife, consumed by grief and fear, blames Paul for bringing his past into their lives. Paul, overwhelmed with guilt, vows to find Caitlin himself, regardless of the consequences. The next morning, Paul begins his search. He instructs his wife to stay home, assuring her that the police will provide protection. His first stop is Mike's house, where he attempts to gather information about the kidnappers. However, Mike is still in shock and unable to provide any useful details. Paul then seeks help from Kane and Francis, who readily agree to assist him. They begin strategizing, utilizing their underworld connections to find Caitlin. Kane and Francis visit a mob leader named Andrew, hoping to gain information about Caitlin's kidnappers. Andrew denies any involvement and insists that no one in their right mind would dare to challenge Paul. Despite being tortured, Andrew maintains his innocence, and it becomes clear that he genuinely knows nothing. The following day, a jogger discovers Caitlin's body under a bridge. The police are notified, and Paul is informed of his daughter's death. He is overcome with grief. During Caitlin's funeral, Paul's colleagues and friends, including an old mafia boss named Frank, attend. Frank advises Paul to let the police handle the investigation, reminding him of his reformed life and successful career. Later, Paul, Kane, and Francis discuss possible suspects. Kane suggests that Caitlin's murder might be connected to a crime they committed 20 years ago, the robbery and murder of the brother of the head of the Russian mafia. However, Paul dismisses this theory, believing there were no witnesses. Meanwhile, the police detective receives forensic reports indicating that Caitlin was shot with a Soviet gun, linking the murder to the Russian mafia family, whose brother Paul and his friends killed. Kane informs Paul of the forensic findings, confirming Paul's suspicion that the Russian mafia is seeking revenge. Paul, Kane, and Francis embark on a violent campaign against the Russian mafia, starting with a massacre at a Soviet-owned bar. Back home, Paul tells his wife to leave town for her safety, indicating that their fight is far from over. They then target the former personal driver of the murdered Soviet brother, Danny. Francis locates Danny, and Paul, Kane, and Francis head to his location. Paul confronts Danny, revealing his involvement in the 20-year-old crime. Danny explains that he has been tortured by the Soviets, who believe he was responsible. Before Danny can provide any further information, Francis shoots him dead. The next day, a detective warns Paul about his violent actions, threatening him with arrest. Paul remains unconcerned. Later that night, Paul and his friends attack a Soviet drug operation, killing several key members. The police, while aware of Paul's involvement, are secretly grateful as the victims were known criminals. The Soviet boss, Chernov, is enraged by the attacks on his operations. He orders his men to find and eliminate Paul and his associates. Soviet men arrive at Kane's bar, and Kane alerts Paul. Paul tries to contact Francis, but receives no response. Kane fights off the Soviets, but is eventually captured and taken away. Paul pursues the Soviets, but the police intervene. The detective, acknowledging Paul's past help, allows him to continue his pursuit, as Paul is targeting known criminals. Meanwhile, Kane is tortured by the Soviets, who demand to know why they are interfering with their business. Kane reveals that they believe Chernov killed Paul's daughter. Chernov is confused, as he had no involvement in Caitlin's murder. Kane explains that Paul and his friends killed Chernov's younger brother 20 years ago, leading them to believe Chernov was seeking revenge. Chernov is furious to learn the truth about his brother's killers. Chernov contacts Frank, Paul's old friend, who is also involved in the 20-year-old crime. Chernov holds Frank responsible, but Frank denies involvement. A shootout ensues between their groups. Paul, reflecting on his past, remembers taking Chernov's pistol, which he still keeps at home. He discovers that the gun has been used and that the bullets match those found in Caitlin's body. Paul realizes that Caitlin's friends, including Mike, are responsible for her death. Paul arranges a meeting with Mike, who confesses to accidentally shooting Caitlin while playing with the gun. He and his friend panicked and disposed of the body, staging the kidnapping to cover their tracks. Paul, realizing it was an accident, forgives Mike. Paul calls his wife, telling her it's over and apologizing for his actions. He explains that he sought revenge to atone for his past mistakes and to ensure his wife's safety from Chernov. Paul prepares for a final confrontation with Chernov's forces, knowing his life is forfeit. He defends his home against their attack, fighting with deadly efficiency. Despite taking down many of Chernov's men, Paul is eventually overwhelmed and killed, paying the ultimate price for his past sins. The story concludes with Paul's final reckoning, a tragic figure confronting the consequences of his violent life. The echoes of gunfire faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Paul lay amidst the wreckage of his home, a testament to the brutal final stand he had made. The once familiar rooms were now a chaotic tableau of shattered glass, splintered wood, and spent shell casings. The air hung thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. Chernov, his face etched with a grim satisfaction, surveyed the scene. He had lost many men, but he had achieved his objective. Paul Maguire, the ghost from his past, was finally silenced.